Okay, Michael Manhart from ETH.
Is the microphone working? Okay. Good. It's really nice to be here. My name is Michael. I'm a junior group leader at ETH, although as of next year I'm moving to the Rutgers University Medical School. And I'm going to change gears a bit, I think, from the last two talks and go back to some more conceptual issues that we've also heard about in the last couple of days, and in particular this topic of nutrient limitation that some people have mentioned, and I want to kind of dive deeper into what this really is all about. And in particular, I want to talk about nutrient co-limitation in microbial communities and its evolution. So the general theme of my group is focused on quantitative evolutionary microbiology, and in particular, we're interested in understanding how fundamental evolutionary processes, such as mutation, selection, and genetic drift, shape ecological and physiological aspects of microbial communities, such as growth dynamics, interactions, and resource consumption. And the group is interested and works on all aspects of this, but today I want to focus on, in particular, how processes of mutation and selection shape resource consumption and how that in turn shapes interactions in microbial communities. And this work has been a collaboration over the last year or so with one of my colleagues at ETH, Noel Held, and my PhD student, Eustace Fink, as well as with some important contributions from a couple of master's students we've had, Ashwin and Donat, and it's been funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation. So I want to address these three questions today. First, I just want to talk about what is co-limitation, and then given such a definition, do we expect microbial communities and populations to be in fact co-limited for multiple resources? And then finally, how would such a state of co-limitation affect a microbial ecosystem, and in particular, its interactions? So I think the traditional view of limitation that a lot of us probably have, certainly it's what I had when I first started thinking about this, goes back to this work of Jacques Monod from about 70 years ago, where if we look at the growth rate of a population as a function of the concentration of a particular resource, like glucose, we would see this sort of dependence here. And we often think about this in this sort of binary way, that there's this state here when glucose is low and we say the resource is limiting, and then there's this other state up here when glucose is high and resource is not limiting. But this is both very binary and also, as you can see here, this is one-dimensional. We're only thinking about this one resource, glucose. But everyone here knows that microbes don't just depend on one resource, they depend on lots of resources. And you just have to look at the periodic table to see all the different elements that microbes need to grow. And this definitely corresponds in many cases to many different actual chemical nutrients that they need. And in fact, when multiple of these resources are rare, this could potentially simultaneously limit growth. And this has long been suspected, especially in aquatic systems, mainly marine systems. So for instance, this is data from this paper about 10 years ago. And if you look at the abundances of all these different elements in dissolved seawater, you can see that many of them are simultaneously rare compared to their cellular requirements. And so this suggests that there may definitely be environments such as this where you have this simultaneous rareness of many things. Okay, but the first question here is how can we actually define limitation? And so we want to emphasize that this is really a quantitative question, and so we need a quantitative approach here. And so first of all, we want to define this quantity for a single resource called the limitation coefficient. And what this means quantitatively is this is the relative change in growth rate you would get for a relative change in the resource concentration. And mathematically, that corresponds to a derivative of the growth rate with the resource concentration, and then we rescale it to make it dimensionless. And so now if we look again at this 1D picture of resource concentration, and you have sort of your Monod dependence of growth rate, this is your limitation coefficient. And instead of having this dichotomy of limiting and not limiting, you replace this with now this continuum of limitation states that vary from 1, when you have sort of maximum limitation, all the way to 0, which is a minimum limitation, and it doesn't have any effect. But there's everything in between. So what about multiple nutrients? Well, you can calculate such a quantity for every resource in your system, and then you can define this quantity that we call the effective number of limiting resources. And this is basically a rescaled average of these limitation coefficients. And what happens is that it ranges from 1 if only one of the resources is at all limiting, to the total number of resources if they're all equally limiting. So for example, if we look at two resources here, and this is just both of their concentrations, we see that there's these regimes up here and down here where this number of resources is very close to 1, and that corresponds to where you have lots of one resource and very little of the other. And then in between, when you have kind of an equal amount of both, you get 2 limiting resources, and that corresponds to co-limitation. But again, this is this quantitative measure, and so there's this whole continuum of states in between. It's not just co-limited or not. Okay, so what can we do with this? So just to give you some intuition for what these numbers could look like, we've collected some data on growth traits for several different species and resources, as well as environmental concentrations of these resources, just to give you some intuition for what these numbers could look like. So here, this is 5 different diatom species. This is 3 bacterial species. And we've done these calculations for a few different models of growth rate, but you don't need to worry about that for right now. The thing that you should notice here is just that if we look at these diatoms, we see relatively strong limitation for many of these resources. So this is from 0 to 1. So many of these are at these intermediate to higher values. Whereas if we look at the bacteria here, there's relatively weak limitation. The numbers are generally quite small for these resources. However, if we look at their co-limitation, so this is this number of limiting resources from 1 to 2, we see that actually for all of these species, there's these kind of intermediate levels. And again, it's quantitative, so it's not just 1 or 2, but we see a lot of levels of co-limitation that are around like 1.5, 1.6 or so. So this suggests that these co-limitation states are in fact feasible given some of the numbers that we actually know from real systems. So given that this might be feasible, what would actually drive a population towards such a state of co-limitation? And there's different mechanisms that you can imagine would do that, but the one that we think is especially important, of course, is evolution. So how does evolution shape co-limitation? And so first of all, we want to look at a single species that's consuming a set of externally supplied resources. So here you have this one species, and it's consuming these 10 different resources. And 10, I think, is actually kind of a reasonable number for how many resources generally a microbe would need. It's not 100, but it's also not 1. So 10 is in between. And so you have this population, and now mutations can arise in this population that change the traits for resource consumption. And those mutations then either fix if they're positively selected and can overcome genetic drift, or they go extinct and they disappear. And so we can simulate evolution of such a population using these kinds of processes. So if we first look at the ancestral state of this population, up here I'm showing the growth dynamics of the population. And it kind of follows what you would expect. So the biomass grows exponentially and then saturates once the resources run out. The resources start at some high level and then decay until at least something runs out and the population stops growing. But if we look at now the limitation coefficients, these are these dynamic quantities, right? They change as the resource concentrations change in the environment. But if we look for pretty much the whole growth cycle here, we see just this one resource in blue is by far the most limiting. And if you look therefore at the number of limiting resources in black, you see it's pretty much always around 1. So this population starts from this state very much of close to single limitation. So now we do this evolutionary simulation. How does it change? So we look at the population dynamics up here, and it's pretty similar. It's just faster because that's obviously selection's driving it to do things faster. But if we look at the limitation behavior, we see that instead of there being like one really limiting resource and the other ones less, we see all the resources have pretty similar levels of limitation. And that corresponds to a number of limiting resources that's about 7. So this population has evolved from this state of single limitation to this state of pretty high co-limitation for 7 of these resources. And the reason for this is because selection, follows sort of this weakest link principle. It's always selecting on traits for the resource that are most limiting. And so it's kind of always driving the population towards this state of kind of roughly equal limitation between the resources. And so that's how you get co-limitation.
So just to clarify, what is evolving?
The traits for consumption of these resources. So that talks about a single species, and externally supplied resources. But as we have heard a lot about at the meeting so far, many resources are in fact cross-fed from different organisms in the environment. And this is a meta-analysis done by my colleague, Glenn, who spoke yesterday, that I think demonstrates this really nicely. And you can see all the wide range of cross-feeding interactions that have been observed in different taxonomic groups, as well as the many different resources that are exchanged this way. So this is definitely a very important way in which resources are supplied. So I think this raises the question of how does co-limitation play out when we're talking about cross-fed resources rather than externally supplied ones. So to do that, we look now at a community model with two species, A and B. There's one external resource here in pink, and then these two cross-fed resources, blue and green, that are exchanged between the two species. And now we can do the same thing. So we look at the ancestral population, and here I'm just showing species A because it's approximately symmetric between the two. So the other one is kind of the same. And if you look at species A here, it grows approximately exponentially. The external resource starts high and then decays down once the population runs out of it. And then the cross-fed resources start at some lower level and then increase as sort of biomass builds up and also accumulates these cross-fed resources. So now if we look at the limitation of these resources, we see that at the beginning of the growth cycle, this green one here, one of the cross-fed resources, is definitely very strongly limiting compared to the external resource, because that one is very abundant initially. But then over time of this growth cycle, there's this switch. So you start building up the supply of the cross-fed resource, so it becomes less limiting, and you start running out of the external resource, so now that becomes more limiting. And so now this limitation state switches between the two. But overall, the level, over one of these whole growth cycles, it's still actually kind of co-limited, because you're limited for both things, but not at the same time. And so I would call this sort of co-limitation, but it's asynchronous. It's happening at these two different times. So what happens if we evolve this community in the same way? So we again allow 10,000 mutations to accumulate over an evolutionary trajectory. The population dynamics, again, basically faster, but qualitatively similar. But now if we look at the limitation coefficients, they've changed quite a bit. So instead of having this very strong limitation for the cross-fed resource at the beginning, you see you have pretty much equal limitation for both of the two resources, cross-fed and external, at the beginning of the growth cycle. And that leads to this very high level of co-limitation right there at the beginning. So you still have high co-limitation here, but instead of being asynchronous at different times, now the co-limitation is synchronous. It's happening at the same time during growth. So what does this evolved pattern of limitation mean for the ecology, in particular the interactions? Well, here, this is the ancestral population. This is the same thing I showed before. So what we can do now is, over these dynamics, calculate the interaction strengths between the two species and also within the species. And so we calculate that down here. The teal is the interspecies, the blue is the intraspecies. And as you can see at the beginning of the growth cycle, there's this strong limitation for the cross-fed resource. And the interspecies interaction is therefore strongly positive because they're limited for the thing that they're supplying to each other. So that's a positive interaction. Whereas, of course, the intraspecies interactions are negative because they're purely competitive. But then as the limitation switches during this growth, there's also a switch in limitation or in interactions. And so as it switches to the state of limitation for the external resource, now both of the interactions, intra and interspecies, become strongly negative. Because now you have plenty of the thing that you're sharing, you're competing for this same thing that's running out. So now you're just competing with each other again. So how does this change over evolution? So at the beginning, we see something that's sort of similar in sign, but now the quantities or the magnitude have really changed. So at the beginning here, you have this co-limitation for both resources. So there's still a positive interspecies and negative intraspecies. But I know it's probably hard to read from where you are, but these are these log scales. And so these are like 10-fold decreases in the magnitude of these interactions. So the signs are the same, but now they're very, very weak. And it's because you have this co-limitation for the two, that now these interactions are all pretty much around zero. So it's like they don't really care about each other anymore. And then at the end, of course, when you have strong limitation for this external resource, they all become negative again. And so what this means is that this evolution towards this weaker limitation corresponds to also a weakening of this positive interaction in the community. And what does this mean for the coexistence of the community? You can look at the frequency-dependent selection on one of the species. So this is selection as a function of the relative abundance of species A. Of course, this has to be negative to have stable coexistence of the two. But you can see now the slope changes. And so in the ancestral community, you have a fairly steep slope around the point of coexistence. And that corresponds to sort of strong stabilizing selection, driving it back towards this, ecological equilibrium. But as evolution occurs, this starts flattening out around that equilibrium. And that means there's still an equilibrium there, but there's much sort of softer selection that's maintaining it at that point. And so, for example, if there are perturbations away from that equilibrium, the community will respond much more slowly to those perturbations. And so the evolved population here will relax back to that equilibrium more slowly than it would in the ancestral community. So now I just want to go back and summarize these main questions that I started with at the beginning. So what is resource limitation? Well, I hope I've provided this kind of framework for thinking about it, but in particular, I want you to remember that it's this dynamic quantity, it's quantitative, and it's multidimensional. So, and these are things I think are important in many microbial systems rather than the sort of static, binary single limitation picture that we often think about. So are microbes co-limited for multiple resources? I think what we've shown in this model is that our null expectation from evolution should be yes. There's other reasons that could change that, but our expectation from evolution should be yes because of selection driving populations towards this state of co-limitation. And even some of the data we have on this suggests that it is in fact feasible. And finally, how does co-limitation affect the ecology of communities? Well, we've seen that consumption of these cross-fed resources tends to evolve towards the state of intermediate co-limitation with external resources. And this overall evolution of weaker limitation tends to weaken interactions, even in cross-feeding mutualistic communities, and that leads to softer coexistence. And this is something, therefore, we might need to be looking for in communities like this that have evolved under these interactions for long times. So finally, as I mentioned at the beginning, I'm moving to the Rutgers Medical School next year, and so I'm recruiting for all kinds of positions in the group, postdocs, graduate students, research assistants, and technicians. So if you're interested in any of these topics or some of the other kinds of things that we've been working on, don't hesitate to talk to me here or get in touch with me by email later. Thanks very much.
Questions? Orkan.
That was really nice. I'm guessing that in the model, the evolutionary simulation, it measures how much each nutrient contributes to growth. Do they contribute equally, or is there a parameter controlling that?
And by how much you mean its stoichiometric components, like how much it contributes to biomass?
Yeah.
Yes. It affects what runs out, but it actually doesn't really affect very much beyond that. So what you're kind of alluding to, I would say, is one of the things that I've not discussed here is there's different traits. You can talk about limitation on different traits. So here I've talked about limitation for growth rate. You can also talk about limitation for the carrying capacity of a population. And those are, in a lot of ways, kind of completely independent things. So here, what's limiting for growth rate actually has nothing to do pretty much with the yields of them. It has to do with kind of at the end of the growth cycle, like what you run out of ultimately will always become most limiting for growth rate because it's just running down to some arbitrarily low concentration. But other than that, it's in principle determined by independent parameters. Because this has to do with how growth rate would respond to these nutrients rather than how much they contribute to the biomass composition.
David.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. That was super cool. I'm just curious that if I understand correctly with your evolutionary model, you don't make any assumptions about trade-offs between the traits for different resource utilizations, which is super cool that you don't have to make those assumptions. But I guess the idea then is that the phenotypes are far from the Pareto front or the Pareto envelope. And I'm just wondering if you had trade-offs between different resource traits, would you expect very different outcomes, or would you expect qualitatively similar predictions?
We have, in fact, considered this possibility. Yeah, I mean, I didn't talk about this at all, but if you look at, say, you can parameterize this by these thresholds, like these Monod thresholds for your resources. And what I'm showing here, yes, is like assuming sort of uncorrelated mutation effects. This is, say, the state of co-limitation. But actually, if you had a trade-off, like what you're saying here, that's something like this, right? And that actually means you're even more likely to go, that's the faster route actually to co-limitation. So you get the same outcome in terms of co-limitation. But it does kind of frustrate selection at some point a bit. You get stuck there and you can't keep going down to lower overall limitation.
Oh.
Very intriguing. And I would like to specify also the first question. What really evolves? Is it the velocity of the transporters taking up the resource?
We're not considering it that mechanistic level, but we're considering it at the level of these thresholds here, basically. So you have your growth rate, and this is a function of all of your different resource concentrations. And so this is some model, and there's many different models for this that we've considered, but they tend to be parameterized in terms of some sorts of thresholds like these Ks that you would see in a Monod model that tell you sort of the threshold at which growth rate starts to decrease rapidly as a function of that resource concentration. And those are the things that are evolving.
But if the resource is completely exhausted, then nothing can be done. Then it's really limited.
Well, then you run out and growth stops. Yeah, these are always essential resources. So once something runs out, growth always stops.
Still something present.
You have to start in a state where everything is present, at least at some finite level.
I have a quick question about the
Yes.
coexistence, evolution on coexistence, because we have heard quite a few examples of communities coexisting for a long period of time, like Angus, yesterday Angus, the 5 species community. So how does your finding, do you think your finding kind of contradicts or supports or is consistent with all these experimental findings?
That's a really good question that I would be interested in discussing with people. I mean, I don't think it contradicts it at all. I mean, you still have coexistence. Yeah. It just changes sort of, at least with this pattern of mutation and selection, it would change sort of, how strong that coexistence is, that I think it would be getting softer and you have more fluctuations.
If more sensitive to perturbations, you would imagine that those experimenters will see it failing somehow, right? I mean, sort of like there's always perturbations going on in the laboratory cultures. I don't know, Angus, have you ever tried perturbing your communities? So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something definitely to look for in these cases, but it would also depend on how much adaptation is really happening in these traits. I mean, a lot of the systems you construct like this in the lab, they're already really good at growing at these resources at low concentrations. And so they've kind of exhausted, I think, a lot of their adaptation at the sort of pure limitation level. But I think that's what you have to test in those cases. Yeah.
Great, let's thank, Angus, the last question.
Yeah, I think this is, a good question and something we need to connect here.
Repeat the question.
Oh, sorry. The question is, there's a prevailing notion that stronger interactions, mutualistic interactions, tend to make systems less stable, whereas I'm kind of claiming the opposite here, that there's weaker positive interactions, and that's making it less stable. I think a lot of this boils down to how you define interaction strength and how you define stability. So this turns out to be a big part of my work all the time, like asking what do these words actually mean that we're using. And so I think we're using a particular definition of interaction strength here that's, again, kind of like limitation, this very dynamic quantity that changes over time as the environment's changing. And I think in our case, I think this makes sense that if you have weaker interactions, you're not competing, you're not interacting at all. So of course you can like move around in your frequencies more. I think that's very intuitive. So I think to me, this is sort of the more intuitive version. I think actually in those cases, that's because people are using, I think, more, other kinds of definitions that I think make a lot of other kind of assumptions or apply to sort of more specific situations. But I would like to talk about that more with you or anyone interested.
Yeah, I think we should start with our tea hours, and then we'll be back at 11 o'clock.
Thank you, everyone.
Awesome, man. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that's all yours.
Yeah, stop sharing is perfectly fine. Awesome. Just stop the share.
I just turned off the